Haiti to Bosnia, to Yugoslavia, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Yemen, to Syria, with the country's political, economic, and military elite seeing power as something to be used in an endless march of tactical situations rather than a tool for shaping the broader picture. For a mix of reasons, political, personal, and institutional, there has been a lack of imagination all around. Bereft of direction from the top, American strategic policy slipped into a thought-free rut. The U.S. Navy continued to provide global maritime security. The American military continued to protect Cold War allies. The American economic system continued to be a sink for global exports. The American system continued to enable all the nuts and bolts of global energy and finance and agriculture and manufacturing. The only change was, the Americans stopped asking for anything in exchange. It had made the world a very strange place. The order had already created the greatest half-century of global economic growth in history. However, in the post-Cold War iteration of the order, the parts of the world that had been left behind due to local political instability, or geographic inaccessibility, or simply for being on the wrong side of the Cold War contest, flooded into the system as well. Continuities and economies of scale extended and added new players. The increased demand for the inputs of industrialization bolstered sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Increased demand for more and better food boosted Latin America and the former Soviet Union. Increased demand for energy helped the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. Increased demand for manufacturers boosted Europe and the East Asian rim, all without the Americans asking for a thing in return for making the entire system possible. The order had been so successful, most forgot, or never learned, that it was even there in the first place. The sheer size of the new system boggles the mind. Just before World War II got moving in 1935, the world's largest fully integrated economy, Germany, had about 62 million people. With the imposition of the American-led order in the late 1940s, the fusion of the American system with the first batch of post-war allies created a system with some 400 million members. Absorbing the Axis powers and several formerly neutral states in the 1950s brought the figure to just shy of 1 billion. By 1980, population growth and the admission of China increased it to 3 billion. And at the time of this writing in early 2020, pretty much all the world's 7.8 billion people are beneficiaries. With each step, the continuity of the order deepened and broadened. With each step, the possible economies of scale expanded. With each step, we came a bit closer to the modern world of computers, on-demand deliveries, widespread and varied food availability, and reliable electricity. But this ever more wealthy, ever more connected, ever more advanced world lost sight of one central, inconvenient truth. American involvement in the order isn't about, was never about, free trade and its subsequent effects as an end. Free trade was the means. Free trade was part of the bribe. Americans never enmeshed their economy into the order. If they had done so, it would have been as if they were establishing an empire with the allies being the new provinces. Instead, the Americans, in their splendid isolation, more or less kept their continent-sized economy to their continent-sized selves. Geographic isolation and abundance are powerful forces of crunch and goo. Today, the United States remains the least integrated major economy in the world, which means that with the notable exception of Soviet containment and defeat, none of the order's advances in energy, agriculture, finance, manufacturing, disease prevention, education, lifespan, democracy, child mortality, and on and on and on were part of the plan. They were merely side effects. No, the order wasn't about money for the Americans, and everyone would do well to remember that longevity and broad political support are not the same thing as sustainability or permanence. The Americans forged, operated, and subsidized the free trade order so that they would have allies to help face down the Soviets. But the Cold War ended in November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. On New Year's Eve, as 1991 ended, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. The world has since changed, and, belatedly, the Americans are changing with it. With the order's strategic rationale gone, the order has had to justify its continuing existence to the Americans. It has not gone well. The Americans in the Third Age. There was no single event that directly translated into American disenchantment with the Bretton Woods Order. With any strategic grounding dissolving in 1992, right along with the Soviet Union itself, the American alliance network has long since become unmoored from all the Cold War realities that cemented the system in place. Everything continued on increasingly surreal autopilot for a while, but a decade after the order's grand success, 3 specific major events in quick succession clarified things. On April 1st, 2001, a Chinese fighter jet collided with an American EP-3 spy plane it was shadowing, crashing both aircraft. The issue quickly escalated into a bilateral snit. The Chinese asserted that the EP-3 was spying on China. True. While the Americans asserted that such flights were not only routine, but that, since the EP-3 was over international waters, the flight was legal under international law. Also true. Bad blood had been rising between the two countries for some time. While the Chinese and Americans had never truly been comfortable with each other, they were allies in the order. The core of U.S. President Richard Nixon's historic trip to China in 1972 was to bring the Chinese into the anti-Soviet alliance network. The normalization process was a monumental success. The Chinese turned monumentally against the Soviets, and that shift exposed the Soviets' entire southern flank to monumental pressure, which probably accelerated the Soviet collapse by more than a decade. It also ushered China into the global network of resources and trade, launching the panda boom. But by 2001, the Chinese were growing tired of deferring to the Americans' increasingly nebulous post-Cold War strategic policy, particularly when tendrils of that policy could be seen from Chinese shores. When the EP-3 accident occurred, the Chinese leadership decided to take a stand. The Americans, furious that an order ally would embrace a military standoff with the country that made their economic success possible, took more than a bit of umbrage. But before the issue could be resolved one way or another transformational event occurred. One idle Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001, Islamic militants hijacked 4 American passenger jets, successfully crashing 3 of them into buildings iconic of American power. For the first time since the War of 1812, a hostile power had struck a major American city. Within a month, American forces were hunting the perpetrators across the length and breadth of Afghanistan. The effort quickly degraded into a whack-a-mole problem. American forces would advance upon a known militant hideout. The militants would catch wind of their approach and vacate. The Americans needed more eyes and more ears and more guns in more places, and so they called upon their entire alliance network to join the hunt. The response was discouraging. Most of America's allies demurred. Many actively resisted. While much has been said and written about the wisdom, effectiveness, and/or execution of the global war on terror, the thing is that from the American point of view, The United States was still providing the economic and strategic largesse of the order, but most of the allies were no longer providing the strategic deference that was supposed to balance the equation. And so the thinking went in Washington, if no one else is upholding their end of the bargain, why should we? On New Year's Day 2002, a dozen European countries jointly ditched their national currencies in favor of a new common currency, the euro. There are any number of reasons why the euro adoption wasn't all that realistic, but it is undeniable that part of the euro's raison d'etre was to pool European economic power so that Europe could provide a non-American pole of power in global affairs. A lingering distaste for the new currency rose up in America. During the imperial age, the Europeans had been at each other's throats. Peace among them had been possible only because of American involvement in World War II, American financial support in the post-war rebuilding effort, American strategic overwatch during the Cold War, and the de facto American subsidization of their economy since 1945 via the order. Without the Americans, there could not be a European Union, much less a euro. And to thank the Americans, the Europeans decided to launch a common currency expressly designed to chip away at American preeminence in global trade and finance. As the years ticked by, the Americans found themselves ever more ticked off. First, the Chinese started claiming airspace throughout their western Pacific periphery, then seas, then islands. Using a mix of economic and military tools, they bit by bit impressed their will upon their region, and did so while continuing to fully exploit every aspect of the order. The Chinese wanted to push the American Navy back from Asian shores, while expecting that same American Navy to continue to make the global ocean safe for Chinese merchandise exports, or for Chinese energy and raw material imports. This fact was not lost on the American Navy. Saudi Arabia's idea of social policy is to hype up their disaffected youth with radical Islam, give them some firearms and explosives, and export them to war zones to fight for Saudi interests. Should some of those groups self-radicalize, give themselves a new name like, say, Al-Qaeda, and start selecting their own targets, such as matching skyscrapers in New York City, the Saudi reaction was typically to shrug, disavow, and form a new group. Saudi Arabia's resistance to taking responsibility for the 9/11 attacks, to ceasing their radical export strategy, to allowing the Americans to hunt for radicals on Saudi soil, fundamentally changed the way many Americans view their allies. The rise of the euro complicated European-American relations, particularly when the Europeans came to Washington hand in hand for help in dealing with the European financial crisis, a crisis that would not have been nearly as severe if not for the euro's creation. This is hardly a comprehensive list. Many other Bretton Woods allies have taken the shine off the alliance. A homegrown crisis in Argentina prompted the Argentines to go hand in hand to Washington for a bailout while they were disavowing debts to U.S. citizens. Australia attempted to use the G20 to muscle its way into global management. Brazil, whose development would have been impossible without scads of foreign funds, led a global effort to diversify global finance away from American institutions. India regularly torpedoed American efforts to tweak the Bretton Woods system via the World Trade Organization. Despite being two of the countries that benefit the most from the order, China supports perennial Asian bugaboo North Korea against the Americans, while Brazil provides economic and diplomatic cover to Venezuela and Cuba. It is difficult to overstate American frustration with allies within the order, who insist on using their newfound strategic cover and economic stability to pick fights with other order members, China with Taiwan, Greece with Turkey, South Korea with Japan. Malaysia publicly condemns American economic leadership, while privately being the world's second most trade-dependent country. Not just China, but also France, Israel, and South Korea regularly engage in espionage against American corporations in order to steal everything from technology to business plans to negotiating guidance. After a terror attack in 2004, Spain pulled out of cooperation with the Americans, not only in the Islamic world, but within NATO as well. Speaking of NATO, the Allies' financial contribution to their national defense was weak during the Cold War. After the Cold War, their defense spending dropped so much that the French cannot move troops without renting tourist ferries, while the bulk of Germany's submarines, surface ships, tanks, and jets cannot even deploy. Canada is just so damn snarky, all the damn time. Many condemn Donald Trump for destroying the global order. Let's be real here.